Today we're going to be talking all about fougères, which are a family of perfumes in perfumery. And this family of perfumes, the fougère, is centered around the Fougère Accord. Now, I've done some videos before on the different raw materials that go into a Fougère Accord, and the main raw materials that go into a Fougère Accord are amyl salicylate. I've done a video about salicylates where I cover that. Coumarin, I've done a video on coumarin where I cover that. And lavender and oak moss, and I've done some videos on natural raw materials where I cover these as well. So if you like, you can go and check out these videos before coming back to this video. Either way, it doesn't matter too much. In this video, I'm going to go over firstly the history of the Fougère Accord and then talk about some of the perfumes which use a Fougère Accord. Then I'm going to go and dive in and make my own Fougère Accord, and I'm going to take you through the various iterations and trials that I tried in order to get to my final Fougère Accord. And then at the end of the video, I'll give you my final formula for the Fougère Accord, so you can go and use that in your own perfumes if you want to go and try it out. So if you're interested in any of those things, then stick around and stay tuned for the rest of the video. If you already watched my video on coumarin, you'll know that coumarin was the first synthetic raw material used in perfumery. By the year 1877, it had gotten to the point where coumarin could be industrially produced for use in perfumery. Now, at the time, perfumers generally were skeptical about putting chemicals in perfumes. This is because up until this point, all perfumery had been using natural raw materials. The idea of using these synthetic chemicals in perfumes seemed like a strange idea and not something that true perfumers would go and do. Now, at the time, someone called Paul Parquet, who was working for the perfume house Hubignon, he went and decided to go and put coumarin in one of his perfumes, and this perfume was something called Fougère Royale. Now, Fougère Royale did extremely well, and it took the other perfumers quite a while to realize that it was actually this synthetic molecule called coumarin, which was the star of the fragrance, which had given it its unique smell. Now, Paul Parquet explained that the name Fougère was chosen because this accord of lavender, oak moss, and coumarin was his kind of interpretation of the way a fern would smell. So the word fougère, that means fern in French, and while some ferns do have a smell, it's not a particularly remarkable smell. It's just a kind of general smell that you would get in some foliage. Some ferns don't really smell at all. But the idea of the Fougère Accord was, imagine ferns had a smell in the same way something like rose or lavender has a smell. So that's where the term fougère came from. Now, the other notes in this perfume were bergamot, orange, rose, geranium, clary sage, vanilla, and musks. These were all common natural raw materials at the time. Remember, coumarin was the first synthetic, so coumarin was the only synthetic raw material in this perfume. Now, over time, as the years progressed, this fougère genre became more and more famous as more and more perfumes started to adopt the same basic structure and started to modify things and build upon it. So some other examples of perfumes in the fougère genre, we've got Jicky by Guerlain in 1889. In this case, they added vanillin and benzoin, so some kind of sweet base notes. They switched out the clary sage for rosemary. They took the rose and geranium, that floral part of the mid-note, and they changed that out for jasmine. And then they also replaced the oak moss with vetiver. Essentially, the only thing that really remained at this point was the lavender and coumarin combination. Now, another really key development in the Fougère Accord was in 1898, and if you'd already watched my video on amyl salicylate, you'll know that in 1898, the perfume Trèfle Incarnat was released by LT Piver, and this was because of their newly discovered molecule amyl salicylate. So this amyl salicylate, once they discovered it, they went and they put it in a Fougère Accord skeleton, and this made this new perfume, Trèfle Incarnat. Now, this perfume was so successful that amyl salicylate effectively defined the genre of fougère going forward. Going forward from this, most fougère perfumes contained amyl salicylate, so it's quite safe to say that amyl salicylate is a core component of a Fougère Accord. After this, of course, there were more perfumes, Some examples: Mouchoir de Monsieur by Guerlain in 1904. This one kept the rose and the oak moss of the original fougere, but they added patchouli and verbena this time. So patchouli is something quite earthy, verbena is quite a citrusy herbal note. Again, in 1955, the addition of basil oil and conifer woods resulted in Pinot Sylvestre. That's that perfume you sometimes see in supermarkets in the little pine tree shaped bottle. And then after that, there were, of course, more and more and more. There are loads in between, and all of these fougere perfumes, there were just loads of them, which is why we call it a genre in perfumery, because all of these perfumes are kind of resting around this central theme of oak moss, lavender, and coumarin, and most of the time amyl salicylate. Most of the time as well, geranium was actually used, and this kind of citrus notes of bergamot and things like orange, that's quite common too. So after this, there were more developments in the 80s, and going forward from these more kind of fresh type fougere perfumes, these are things that you would find in kind of deodorants or shaving foams a lot to this day. We're not going to talk about that in this video because it's kind of out of the scope of this video. This video is just going to be a bit more about classic fougere accords, but potentially in the future I could do another video about the more modern fougères and the more fresh subgenre of fougères as they're called. Okay then, so in looking at the history of the fougere, both as an accord and the perfumes in which it was used, we've already kind of uncovered pretty much what the structure of a fougere is. So most sources seem to cite that it's the combination of lavender, oak moss, and coumarin that make up a fougere, though some sources do say that amyl salicylate is more important than the oak moss, for example. A lot of places also seem to suggest that the geranium and the citrus, particularly the bergamot, are also key components. So we're going to go and start making up some accords based on these things to test out what these different combinations smell like. So starting off, I went to make an iteration of the fougere, especially since I hadn't ever really smelled a fougere before. I thought, let's start by just taking the most core components and putting those together and seeing what they smelled like. So what I did was I made a version of the accord where I simply take amyl salicylate, coumarin, lavender, and oak moss and put them together in equal proportions to make a basic fougere accord. At the same time, I also made a version of this without the amyl salicylate, so I would know what it smelled like if you removed that. And I also made a version of this without the oak moss because that was the second most thing that seemed to be not quite as important as the other ones in the combination. So firstly, for the first fougere accord, so I thought it initially to me when I first smelled this, so I was doing these evaluations as I was making them, by the way, which was about, well, a week ago or within the last week. So I've still got the scent strips here, but most of these scent strips have been dipped a while ago, so they've only got the base note left. So I'm kind of using my notes of what I smelled at the time when I smelled the top note, but then I've also got the base note still here to smell. So that first fougere iteration that I made, this reminded me at the time of kind of a soapy shower accord, something I could imagine in like a shower gel or a shaving foam, but more of like a traditional barbershop style shaving foam, something you would imagine with like maybe older people or something very regal and traditional, not something you would imagine in like a modern thing, not something like Lynx, something very kind of herbal and let's just say barbershop traditional smelling. So it reminded me a lot of that. And I thought it was quite interesting because it really had a strong herbal element to it. And I thought that was really quite nice. It seemed to be the character of this accord, this interesting, quite distinctive herbal note. And it wasn't just the herbal note of the lavender on its own, but I could clearly see that the sharp parts of the coumarin had contributed to that. And later on, when I went to look at my iteration without the oak moss, so the one where I cut the oak moss out, what I found is without the oak moss, it smelled a lot more clean, but it had a lot less of that distinctive herbal character. So at that stage, I also realized that the oak moss, especially the top note part of the oak moss, is really important in contributing to that distinctive, strongly kind of herby, fougere, green kind of fern interpretation that is the accord. Now, I did find then when I took out the amyl salicylate, so that iteration I made without the amyl salicylate, that didn't affect the accord quite so much. I still felt like the character of the accord was present without the amyl salicylate, but I did notice one key difference. When I removed the amyl salicylate, I felt like the accord was a lot more rustic. It was a bit more rough around the edges. The way I would kind of describe it was that it felt like that accord without the amyl salicylate, just the oak moss, lavender and coumarin, that was like going to a perfume shop in a village in the middle of France with loads of herbs lying around. It was a very kind of rustic, herbal kind of accord. When, on the other hand, the amyl salicylate was present, it felt a lot more elegant, a little bit sweeter as well. This time it felt more like I was going into a perfume shop in the middle of Paris and going to buy my perfume there instead. Okay then, so on to the next set of iterations. So next what I really wanted to do was discover the effect of geranium and bergamot. So again, I added an equal proportion of both geranium and bergamot to that initial fougere formula with all 4 components, and I did that in 2 separate trials. Now what I noticed for the geranium was that it added a sweetness. It added kind of like a rose-like honey sweetness to the accord. It reminded me a bit of the aroma chemical phenylethyl acetate. This was definitely too strong, the effect, in the trial that I tried, at the level which I tried it, but the overall kind of combination I could tell was good. Now with the bergamot on the other hand, again, the combination was good, but again it was too strong. So with the bergamot, it did seem to work. This time it accentuated the herbal side a little bit more. It added that slight Earl Grey tea characteristic, which bergamot usually does, and it added a citrusy herbal element to the accord, which again, I thought it worked well, but it was a little bit too strong and that it seemed to kind of dominate a bit as with the geranium, and both of these 2 things pulled them away, I thought, a bit too far from that original herbal kind of characteristic combination, which is what I thought was really nice about the original fougere accord. Now also at this time, while I was making these in parallel, I decided to do a trial where I actually would start to respect the IFRA limits. So if you guys don't already know, IFRA limits are certain limits or restrictions you do on the levels of certain raw materials in order to keep your perfume safe. Now that original trial that I tried with the fougere accord, it actually turned out that the oak moss and the coumarin were too high of a level. So in essence, I wouldn't have actually been able to sell a perfume at that level because it would have been deemed that it was unsafe. So I thought, okay, let's bring the coumarin and oak moss down to safe levels. So the coumarin, I halved it, and that took it within the 1.5% limit. Now I did think actually in the original formula that coumarin was a little bit too strong anyway, so I thought this change is kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Then the oak moss, the restriction on oak moss is a lot bigger than the restriction on coumarin. So with oak moss, it really depends which oak moss you have for the restriction, but for my specific version of oak moss, it was a restriction of 0.35% in the final product. So what I did was I took down the level of oak moss actually a bit beyond that to 0.2%. And then because we'd cut out so much oak moss, I thought immediately, hey, we probably want to replace a bit of this with something. So what I thought was, well, the biggest constituent in oak moss as a natural raw material is the aroma chemical called Evenil, or sometimes called Veramos. And I already have that as an aroma chemical, so I thought let's replace the missing volume, so the amount of oak moss, sorry, not volume, I meant to say mass. Let's replace the missing mass of oak moss, so that which I'd cut out. That same weight, let's just add back in some Evenil to replace it, and hopefully that will not ruin the accord too much. Now I tried this accord, and it wasn't too bad, but what I did notice with this version was it started to smell a little bit more soapy, which I didn't like so much. And also the character, that kind of herbal character had gone, it felt a bit weaker. So I felt it had definitely made the accord worse in a sense. So this led me on to my third set of trials. Now in the third set of trials, I was really thinking about the soapiness, so I decided to reduce the amyl salicylate a little bit, because that's something that on its own smells a little bit soapy, so I thought it's probably being caused by that. Also at this stage, I thought, let's add in that geranium and that bergamot, but knowing what I found in the trials before, that they were a bit too strong, let's try them at a lot lower levels. So let's add them in, but just a little bit. And I made that as a trial. At the same time as this, I'd actually just got a book recently called Introduction to Perfumery, and in that book there is a skeleton fougere formula, so an example formula for a fougere. And I decided at the same time I would make this, so I could kind of compare my fougere formula with that one. Now in this fougere formula, funnily enough, they'd actually gone over those limits for coumarin and oak moss, and they'd also gone and added jasmine, rose, vetiver, and patchouli. So vetiver is quite a warm, woody thing. Patchouli is quite earthy. Jasmine and rose, of course, are their distinctive floral scents. So I'll put these formulas up on the screen so hopefully you can see them, but I went and made both of those, and what I found was the fougere that I made was even more soapy than before. I felt like it wasn't really going in the right direction. That said, I did kind of feel like the addition of the geranium and bergamot had made it into a bit more of like a generic floral traditional fragrance, something maybe a bit more balanced, less again towards that herbal side of things, which I did like, but it did seem to kind of seemed to go towards something better and away from it at the same time, let's just say, with that trial. With the one that I'd copied from the book, what surprised me the most was that was like really, really soapy. It also had a very strong sweet floral element of the rose, which of course, I said like, I thought it smelled nice in the sense that, you know, like adding rose to something normally makes it smell nice. It just kind of smelled like the smell you get when you add a load of rose to something. In the base note, I do think actually adding these extra things like the patchouli and vetiver, they added quite a bit of depth to it. They certainly do, they make it smell more like something that I've smelled before. Actually, this basic fougere formula, I think it is a good example of a fougere, just because if you smell that formula, if you go and make it, you'll immediately, there's a good chance you'll immediately recognize that as the kind of scent that they often would put in maybe like fancy soaps and things like that. It of course does smell quite old-fashioned, but all of these basic fougere accords, they do smell quite old-fashioned, and that's because modern perfumes these days rely on a lot of modern synthetics, which, let's say, allow you to make a lot cleaner or different effects that you just couldn't have made back in the day. Anyway, so I'd made these trials and I thought, well, the fougere isn't really going in the direction I want. It's kind of getting more and more soapy, and I thought it was the amyl salicylate, but reducing that, albeit a little bit, didn't seem to really affect it. So maybe it was the lavender instead. And also I was thinking at this stage, well, it's probably good to start experimenting with some different variations, especially because in that example formula, they started adding these florals like rose and jasmine, and things like rose and jasmine are often used, a floral is often used in the heart note of a perfume. So I thought, let's reduce the lavender, and then let's go and try some different florals as well. So I thought, let's add the rose base on its own, let's add the jasmine on its own, and then let's also add ylang ylang, because that's just another floral that I happen to have and I got recently. Let's try out those four as different variations on the accord and see how they go. So I tried all of these, and one thing I forgot to mention is, for these variations, you could say I'm starting to do quite a few steps in an iteration at this point. So the danger with this is that it's hard to discern always what is the effects of the thing you're adding when you're adding multiple things. But I thought at this stage it was appropriate, given that it was with raw materials that I already kind of have used a fair amount before, so I do know already in the back of my head a bit the effect. If you are a complete beginner, I would recommend a bit more just adding one thing at a time in every different trial you do. But yeah, the point was I also added a little bit of ambroxan, which you could say is a bit of a cheat code, because adding ambroxan is essentially a way of making most things smell a bit nicer. I also added some labdanum absolute, which is another raw material that I use all the time. I really love it. It's kind of got this resinous, ambery, slightly sweet, a bit leathery scent about it. You can use it all over the place in a lot of things, so I thought, why don't we add a touch of that? It usually can have a good effect. So I went and did these trials, and here's what I thought. So firstly, the trial with the rose. Now, what I'd accidentally done here is, by adding rose and labdanum together to the Fougere Accord, which still has this oak moss in, I'd essentially gone and made a Chypre Accord. If you're not familiar with the term Chypre, so Fougere, which is what this video is about, is a major class of perfumes and a key accord in perfumery. And Chypre is another class, essentially just like Fougere. And actually the two are quite close together, so I'll do another video about it, hopefully in the future. But for now, just know that adding the labdanum and the rose essentially turned the Fougere Accord into a Chypre, and you can definitely smell that. So I thought, this is probably not really the objective of this study to kind of go in that direction, so I thought, let's just ignore that trial for now. Then with the jasmine and the ylang ylang, again, the labdanum was quite prominent in these trial blends, more than I'd really meant it to be, but I didn't think that the jasmine worked that well. It's not to say a jasmine note wouldn't go with the Fougere Accord, it's just that it added quite a noticeable indolic note, and if you have smelled indol before, you'll know it's this quite, let's just say it's a bit of a animalic kind of fecal odour. And it's something you just might not always want in your Fougere Accord. So given that I'm trying to make a generic Fougere Accord here, I didn't think this was a good thing to continue with. Again, the ylang ylang. This is kind of a spicy floral note. After putting that in the accord, it was quite subtle, but at the end of the day, I didn't really think it added to it in any particular way, maybe even detracted. So all in all, this set of iterations, you could say they weren't really very successful. Maybe I tried to do too much here by adding all these florals, adding all these extra amber notes in as well. But basically, at this point, what I really felt was I needed to go back to basics and rediscover that kind of original herbal Fougere character that I really liked about the first iteration. So what I thought here was, well, really what must have been missing was simply the coumarin and the oak moss missing due to those IFRA limits. So maybe instead of focusing on adding all these extra components, I should go back to working out how I can recover some of that lost character as such. So I cut out the labdanum. I really didn't think that that was a necessary part of the Fougere at all. I kept the ambroxan actually just because I thought, you know, ambroxan, adding it to things, I mean, it usually makes them smell better. I didn't think it really hurt in this case to have any ambroxan in the accord. Now what I thought about was, well, given that the coumarin we're limited at about 1.5%, there is actually a replacer that I know of. And if you remember when we did the coumarin video, we looked at something called bicyclononolactone. So I thought, how about if we go in and add some of that to make the concentration of total coumarin-like smelling things back up to what it would have been in that original iteration or somewhere around that level. So I went and added some of that bicyclononolactone, and then I thought, okay, now we've done the coumarin, we need to look again at the oak moss replacer. So we've gone and added in this Evernyl or Veramos, which, as far as I can tell, is having an alright effect, but it's not adding that kind of a bit more nuanced effect that the real natural oak moss has. So I started thinking, what other things do I have that might be able to emulate just a little bit that kind of character, that forest floor, slightly sweaty part of the oak moss, which the Evernyl alone doesn't have. And the only thing I could think of was this one thing I have called Pine Needle Absolute. I wouldn't say it smells exactly the same as oak moss by any means, but it does remind me of it to some degree. I would probably say it's the closest natural that I have to it in terms of the way it behaves over time and also the way it smells. So I took the Pine Needle Absolute and I added an extra, just one drop, so that was 0.015 grams in my case of this to the formula. And then I coined this as a new iteration, which was my fifth and final iteration for the accord. So I've got to say, I was actually quite happy with this iteration in the end. So I really did feel like I managed to recover all of the herbal character from the first trial pretty much. And I actually think that this does smell more balanced overall than that first trial as well, which I thought was quite a nice development on it, essentially. So what I had done here was I cut out the geranium as well, so all of the floral character had really gone, but that was kind of intentional because I thought when using this fougere accord that I'm making, you can go in and add geranium and things like rose and any other florals quite easily, and you can very quickly bring it back into that more floral, generic direction of the fougere accord. But since I wanted something that was quite versatile, that could be used in a lot of contexts, especially say you're making a fresh aromatic citrus cologne or something like that where you don't really want those floral elements so much, then I thought this could be used there as well. Now I really do, as I say, I like this iteration because again the coumarin didn't really feel too strong anymore like it did with the first iteration. I guess having switched some of it for the bicyclononolactone must have helped with that a little bit. I also felt that it just had a bit more character, so I'm guessing that the Pine Needle Absolute replacement for a bit more of that oak moss, that must have helped to some degree as well. And then I'm guessing the Ambroxan must have helped a little bit, just give that kind of general nice radiant effect that it seems to give to things. Overall, this composition was quite blended, quite nicely blended. You can smell pretty much all of the components if you try to, except for maybe the Pine Needle Absolute and maybe a bit the bicyclononolactone as well, though that's a good thing because they weren't really meant to be there for their own smell if you think about it. What I did feel was that, again, there wasn't too much of a soapiness, which had been something I've been trying to avoid. And in hindsight, I think the reason that the soapiness was there was more for a lack of oak moss and coumarin, I guess, covering up maybe the lavender and amyl salicylate. I'm still not completely sure. But now there's enough of those kind of things back in. You kind of get that original, quite strong, what I would basically call a fougere smelling smell. And that is what this accord seems to smell like to me. So I'm pretty happy with this. So if you guys want a fougere accord to go and build your own things from, then I would say this is as good a place as any to start. Though, of course, feel free, based on all the things I've said in the video, to try out maybe some of the other variations that I've done, if you like the sound of those, but also go and make your own variations. So there's so many directions you could take this in. You could go and add different base notes, so things like vetiver, patchouli, vanillin. You could go and add a lot of florals, so go and try what the rose smells like. I've also heard that heliotropin, another floral, is used quite a lot, so that might be a good thing to try. And then of course you could also go and push like the citrus side or the fresh aromatic side, so you could go and add things like sage, rosemary, or you could go and add things like grapefruit, lemon, orange, other citrus raw materials, and see how it gets you. So this is all for me on fougeres. Thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you are looking for more discussion about perfumery, we just went and made a new perfumery Discord group. So if you're interested in discussing a little bit more about perfumery than you can down here in the comments on YouTube, feel free to go and join our perfumery Discord server where you can kind of go and ask. There's a group of us, it's about 50 or so now, and we casually can kind of ask people questions or for advice with different things in perfumery. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out. I'll put a link in the description below. And apart from that, thank you for watching. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.